kindred in Christ for his dear sake, a hearty welcome here receive. May we together now partake the joys which only he can give. May he by whose care we meet him, it's the Spirit from above, make our communication sweet and cause our hearts to burn with love. For God to be each worldly thing when Christians meet together thus, we only wish to speak of him who lived and died and reigns for us. We'll talk of all he did and said and suffered for us here below, the path he marked for us to tread, and what he's doing for us now. Thus as the moments pass away, we'll love and wonder and adore and hasten on that glorious day when we shall meet to part no more.
Mindful of the love that Christ has for his people. It's an everlasting love. It's an unquenchable love. It's an eternal love. I mean, when I begin to think about the love of Christ and try to, in my finite way, I begin to try to think, well, when did Christ begin to love his people? And it's an eternal thing. It's in my mind, I just can't comprehend it. There was never a time, brothers and sisters, where you are not the object of the love of the Lord Jesus Christ. Always been in that covenant of redemption. It's an eternal covenant. It's just things like that. I heard of something on the radio, a guy talking about raising his children. A little boy asked his daddy, said, "Daddy, where did the grasshoppers come from?" And the daddy was explaining to the little boy how God had made everyone, he called them hoppers. Every one of them hoppers was designed by God, by the Creator. And he said, well, where did we come from? He said, well, we were designed by the same Creator that created and designed the grasshopper also created us. And the last question the little boy asked was, where did God come from? And there's just silence, because it's not, I mean, I have tried, maybe it was when you were kids, maybe you tried to think about how do you comprehend something that has no beginning? I just have to take it for what it says. It is what it is. And I'm glad that I've gotten past that. The last song that we sang is one of my favorite songs. Is "My Faith Looks Up to Thee." We do all things by faith. As God's people, we are commanded to walk by faith and not by sight. And there's a tendency sometimes that we get into, that we tend to sometimes over-spiritualize things. And by over-spiritualize, I mean we lose sight of the instructions in the Scriptures. As Brother Randy was praying for us, my mind went over to one of the commandments that God gave: "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." I believe it's in the 20th chapter of the book of Exodus. Those 10 commandments that were given. And if I were to ask Paul, the apostle, Paul, why do you believe that God gave those 10 commandments to the children of Israel? I can almost hear his answer, because he's answered it before. When he spoke to Timothy and Titus and to you and I, he said, "So that thou mayest knowest how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God." When we pray, and Brother Randy was praying about letting our light shine, that people might see the good things that God has done for us. It's never been about us. It's always been about serving Christ, seeking first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, the righteousness of Christ, knowing what our priorities are. But Paul had set things in order, because the scriptures also say that my people, that's the spiritual people of God, perish for a lack of wisdom, lack of understanding, lack of knowledge, not knowing better. I mean, I say perish, we're not talking about dying and going to the devil's hell here. But we're talking about perishing in the world, not being thoroughly taught. My mind is all scattered this morning. Another fellow that I went down to Fort Neches over this last weekend and had a good meeting down there with Elder Mike Rhodes and his family. And somebody during that meeting made a comment to me that they said, I pray that the world that I give my children is not the same world that my parents gave me. About my age, maybe a little younger. And that got me to thinking about what has been on my mind since I've been coming up here about these what they call these pastoral epistles that the Apostle Paul was writing to young Timothy and over in the book of Titus about the things he was insisting upon sharing with the church. And again, that the church might know how they ought to behave themselves in the house of God. And when this brother said that, I thought to myself how I remember that day that I was sitting in the old Baptist church, hadn't been a convert very long, and I know that the pastor had been preaching about election and predestination, which was a beautiful thing. But I remember thinking to myself in connection to those things, that I know, brother, I believe in those things: election, limited atonement, sovereign grace. I believe in those things, but I remember thinking, give me something I can live with today. I need something to guide me today. I don't know what the issue was, but there was an issue. I don't remember what it was, but I needed some direction in my life and some encouragement, and did not know at the time that they were found in the pages of Scriptures. I mean, I was raised, I've told you, I was raised an old Baptist, raised in the Nazarene church and in Sunday school. I can't remember one single time in a Sunday school that I ever had any actual instruction on how I ought to conduct myself in the house of God. And yet the Scriptures are full of it. The Scriptures have more to tell us about how we ought to live our lives in service to God than they have to tell us about going to heaven. There's more Scriptures written about concerning God's kingdom, the church, than there is about heaven's glory world. And if I haven't said it before, Paul says it, or not Paul, but the writer of the Hebrew letter, I think it's still talking about Paul. He said, I have not seen or entered into the mind of man those things that God hath reserved for them that love him. He's talking about heaven's glory world. Paul, again, was caught up in the third heaven and said that he saw things that was not lawful to be written, to be uttered. And I used to wonder what that meant, and I got to studying it and found out that Paul was simply saying that there wasn't words in existence that he could use to describe what he saw. It's not lawful. It was a law he could not break. Couldn't write it. Couldn't make you understand it. There was no... I guess the closest thing I could come to was to try to describe... You ever thought about how to describe the color blue to somebody who's never seen blue? They're blind. Try it sometime. Just think about it sometime. It's near impossible. There's no point of reference. There's no word that can describe what you see to somebody who never saw it. There's no way you do it. So the Apostle Paul, knowing that the church is a spiritual entity, it's a spiritual organism. Notice I did not say an organization. The church is not an organization. It's an organism. It's alive. She's the bride of Christ. And Paul knew, as I said before, he knew that his time was drawing near. That he would soon somehow God had revealed it to him that his life on this earth was short. And there are things that he wanted to say to the church, not a pity party. I find nothing in any of these texts where Paul is focused on himself. I mean, it would have been easier for Paul to say, look at the bad situation I'm in. Chained between these two Roman guards and in prison and being persecuted by my brethren of the Jews, and being hungry and thirsty and ship. You know those things that we know that Paul was going through. And yet, what is his focus in the book of 1 Timothy? It's focused on that young brother. Paul honestly knew what it meant to put Jesus first, others second, and himself last. He understood. And therefore he was able to say that I've learned in whatever stayed I am therein to be content. Something that we miss today. And I was talking to my wife this morning. I've taken a long time introducing this, but I'll get to my subject about our government. And I'm not making this political here, but I thought about the things that Paul talks about, in this, especially in this 5th chapter, about the things that we're supposed to do to help our widows. And I thought how we've gotten so far away from this, where the government has provided. The government is not very good about doing the things that God commands His children to do. And I think you'll see that as I go. There are things that we need to understand as the church. And let me say this word, tradition. See, there are some traditions that are out in the world, but some of them are good. Some of them are not so good. Some of them are really bad traditions. Our task in the church as God's people is to ensure that whatever tradition we have in the church lines up with thus saith the Lord. No more, no less. And to do the commandments of God, do those things He commanded us to do. And that's what this book, the 1 Timothy's letter that he wrote, it's all about. And he opens up this 5th chapter, if you got your Bibles, and you'll turn me to the 5th chapter. There's a lot in this, and I'm going to do my best to try to make it to the very end. He said, rebuke not an elder. Now, I want you to understand when he says elder here, he's not talking about an ordained elder here. He's talking about somebody who's old, somebody who's aged. And by age, let me give you an age, because Paul's going to talk about this in a minute. He's talking about 60 years and above. Talking about 60-year-old. And I'll tell you why in just a minute. But he said, rebuke not, don't censure, don't mistreat, don't strike an elder, but entreat him. This word entreat means to encourage. We live in a generation today where age is disrespected. I see it all around me, where there's no regard for the elderly, no regard by young people today. What a lot of young people fail to realize is that if they live long enough, they will be those elderly people. It will happen one day. He said to treat him as a father. Now the scripture tells, call no man father upon the earth. He's not talking about not calling somebody a father in the ministry, but he's talking about some exalted title. And I don't want you to say much about that. You know what I'm talking about. But to treat him as a father, treat him as if he is your father. Treat him with that kind of respect. And the younger men as brethren. Now there's principles that I would like to look at it. And I want to begin by briefly going over to the book of Leviticus. Keep your finger there. We're going to come back in a minute. I want to go to Leviticus chapter 19. Deuteronomy, Leviticus, here it is. And I want to pick up this principle here. Just one little verse in verse 32. He says, thou shalt raise up before the hoary head. H-O-A-R-Y. That's a Hebrew word, and what it means is somebody who's got white or gray hair. Now, my son's been married a little short time, and he's a young man. I notice he's already starting to gray. You can take that for what it's worth. But it says, but honor the face of the old man, and fear thy God. You know, by honoring the elderly, we are honoring God. Whenever we disrespect the elderly, we are disrespecting God. He said, I am the Lord. Now, we can't look at this without having our mind be thinking about what Paul had to tell the church at Ephesus. Let's go over to the 6th chapter of the book of Ephesus and pick up what the Apostle Paul has to teach us there. In Ephesians chapter 6, pointing back to some of these same principles, starting in the very first verse, he said, children. Now, I'm old enough, I'm an adult, but I'm a child of somebody. I've got a father who's still alive, an adopted mother, and one mother has went on to the Lord. I'm also a child. The scriptures admonish us and identify us as children of God. We're all children. So it says, children, obey your parents in the Lord. Obey them. Do what they tell you to do. I'm talking about godly parents here. He said, for this is right. This is right is the same thing as saying, well, see, it's the right thing to do. Don't do it because you have to do it. Do it because it's the right thing to do. He says, honor thy father and thy mother. Paul is in a perfect agreement with what the law instructed the children of Israel, to honor the elderly. You know, it's a benefit, brothers and sisters, that children are missing out on by not honoring the adults. You know, it makes sense to me to honor those that are older than me. And you can be further and further in between these days too. But see, it's a good idea to know somebody who's been down the road, who knows where the pitfalls are at, who knows where the potholes in the road are at, where you're likely to have an accident, or when you're in discouragement, to be able to talk to somebody who's been where you're at, and has been discouraged, and has overcome. The young person be able to sit there and talk to the older person and say, how did you overcome this? What a blessing it is for our youth to have such a resource. He said, honor thy father and thy mother, which is the first commandment with promise. And that promise is found, and it's in Exodus chapter 20, but we're not going to go over there because Paul is reciting it here. Said, that it may be well with thee. I have never met a person who dishonors the elderly who have a happy life. You know, they go to parties, they get involved in all kinds of extracurricular activities, but they're never happy. I haven't found it. I may be wrong about this, but so far, I used to be a young man too. You all used to be young men, but I find that when I dishonor my father and my mother, when I dishonor those that were older than me, things didn't go well for me. It tells me that there's a God in heaven that will not be mocked. That it may be well with thee, that thou mayest live long upon the earth. That word long means having a long life. It doesn't mean you'll live to be 120 years old. But he's talking about your families. He's talking about your families and their names, and it will go on uninterrupted. So let's get back to our text. I want to have time to finish this up. Back to 1 Timothy chapter 5. He said, rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father, and the younger men as brethren. There's a principle here you've heard old Baptists talk about the elderly mothers, we call them mothers in Israel, or the elderly brethren in the church, fathers in Israel, pillars in the church, support for the church. And I said, this is not talking about ordained elders, and I know it's not because it said the elder women. There's no such thing as ordaining a woman to the office of the elder. You see what I'm getting at? Paul's not talking about a position in the church. He's talking about a rank in age. He said, and the elder women as mothers and fathers. Treat every older person as a loving mother, and the younger as sisters, with all purity. Here's something else that's missing in our society today. This word purity, it means with integrity, with wholesomeness. What we're missing in our generation today is that wholesomeness, you know. I can't pass by a billboard without seeing there's something unholy and unwholesome about that billboard. You can't hardly turn on a television set without glorification of everything that's backwards, everything that's evil, everything that's upside down, and everything that God hates in this world. He said, honor widows. See, this is something that Lisa and I talked about coming down here. Paul's got some things to say about the church. And before I begin to read this, I want to tell you something. We don't need programs in the church. You don't need a program to do things. You just need to obey the scriptures as a church. So keep that in mind. Honor widows. Respect widows. Take care of your widows. That are widows indeed. Now, Paul's got some things he's going to tell us about what qualifies as a widow indeed. Remember, Paul is talking to Timothy. And he's telling Timothy, this is your responsibility. See to it that these things get done. See to it, Timothy, that the church honors and respects, upholds, and supports the widows. But they must be widows who are widows indeed. The English word indeed means in doing. That their deeds, you can see it by what they do. See, how else can we judge? The scriptures tell us we will judge them by their fruit. By their fruit we will know them. We cannot judge the heart, but we can judge the fruit that grows on the tree. See, I can't look at a particular tree. Sometimes if it's bad enough, I can tell. But you can't just look at the average apple tree and tell if it's an apple tree. Especially in the winter. But when it bears leaves and begins to bear fruit, then you can tell the fruit. If the fruit's bad, you know the tree's bad. So we're fruit inspectors. He said, but if any widow have children and nephews, listen, this is the part I told you I couldn't remember exactly how Paul was saying this. But he says, honor the widows. Now here's the stipulation. But if any widow, now when I say widow, we're talking about women here. But let's don't miss the fact that we may be talking about widowers here too. There's a such thing as a male widow. But Paul in particular is pointing out to the necessity of taking care of the widows. Now there's a reason why he did this. In Paul's age, in Paul's day, if you lived to be 45, you were old. If you found somebody who was 80, you found somebody who lived extremely long. It was very unusual for the average man to live much past 45. He worked himself to death. He did not have the benefit that you and I have with vaccinations. He couldn't just go to the doctor and get an antibiotic. A lot of times when they got sick, it was a sickness that was unto death. So he says, so you find that, and their sole support for the wife was her husband. So that's why he said it the way he is. But if any widow have children or nephews, when he says children and nephews, what he's talking, he's saying the word family. If they got family, nephews, children, let them learn first to show piety at home. He said to the church, you make sure that when you start honoring your widow, you make sure that the families are doing their duty to their parents. Honor thy father and thy mother. And who that commandment to? Is to the children, to the family. He said, see that they show piety, self-support, pity, grace, mercy at home, and to requite their parents. Now, I tried to go get this word requite to say something that I wanted to say. I couldn't get it to say it. Requite means to pay back. I'm sorry, it means exactly that. It says, be sure that the children are repaying their parents for their debts. What debt do they owe? They were born. Somebody say, well, I owe my parents nothing. Well, you were born. You're able to move around. You've got some, maybe your clothes on your back and a home and something to eat. There's something to be thankful for. And I'm going to tell you right now, this is not something that the children can expect that this debt will ever be paid. It's an attitude thing. Be sure that the children have been taught to respect their parents, to love their parents, to take care of their parents, requite their parents. For it is good. It's a benefit. It's a benefit to the children because Paul said that your days may be long upon the earth. It's a benefit to the church because the church is strong. He said, and acceptable before God. This word acceptable means ordained. Same word. That God has appointed this to be so. If we don't do these things, we're doing something that's contrary to the will of God. And that's why I said, if I think about our history as a country, when they started Social Security, I've got nothing against Social Security. But I can tell you when it was started, it was never intended to be somebody's sole support. It was intended to help those children take care of their parents. That's what it was for, to lessen the burden. But look what it's become now. Now people are dependent upon it, and it's giving children the excuse for not caring for their parents. Now in verse 5 he said, now she that is a widow indeed in doing, so we're going to begin to identify it, and desolate. He said, okay, she's a widow in the things that she's done, and she's desolate. Desolate means exactly what you think it means. It means there's no one there. There's no children, there's no nephews, there's no cousins, there's no family. She's by herself. Get this now. But she trusted in God. One of the deeds that we see in this widow is her service to God, her love for Christ. These are the ones we call pillars in the church. This is what we're talking about. And she continueth in supplications. That means this is a widow that will pray for you. A supplication means she's going to God on your behalf, not on hers, but on your behalf. She heard that you needed something. Maybe she didn't have the resources, but she went to God and lifted up your name before God in supplication and prayers night and day. You see the character of this widow who is a widow. These are the deeds that we're talking about. But she that liveth in pleasure is dead while she liveth. He's saying even a widow. If a widow is living for herself without regard to these things, then she's separated. She's already divided herself. If she didn't teach her children to honor their father and their mother, the end result is she'll be left desolate. Her children will abandon it. We see it all around us. These things, he said, give charge that they may be blameless. What Paul is saying is this. He said, you be sure that these widows and these parents are teaching their children that they will not be blameless, that their children will not be blameless. What's Paul saying? He said, don't wait until they've grown up and then start getting back to your children because they didn't do it if you didn't teach it to them. When do we start doing this? We start today. If we haven't been doing it up to this point, the time is now. The time we need to start is now. He said, but if any provide not for his own, in respect of those of his own house, he hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. So where does Paul tell Timothy that charity begins? He said it begins at the home. It begins with the children. It begins with the parents bringing their children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. He says, if he doesn't take care of his family, if a man does not take care of his family, he's no better than an infidel. He says, let not the widow, look at this, let not the widow be taken into number. You're going to make a list of widows, Paul's saying to Timothy. You're going to have a list of people that you're considering that need your support. Now, let's put this in modern context. We've got Social Security. We've got some certain benefits. Now, because that is true, does that mean the church has no responsibility to their widows? No, it doesn't mean that at all. It means the church has still got a responsibility. The church should never, ever, I repeat, never give over that responsibility to the government or anybody else for that matter. He said, but let her not be taken up that is under 60 years old. That's the age of 60. Think about it. What did we say about how long the average man lived? About 45 years? 60 is a long time. So we're talking about a widow who's at least 60 years old. Now, is Paul saying that we ought to not take care of one that's 59? He's not saying that. This is an example. This is a pattern that Paul is setting up for taking care of the widows and the widowers for that matter. But he said, having been the wife of one man. Now, if we're talking about a man, would we be saying that he's been the husband of one wife? It's the principle that we need to get here. That we're looking for somebody who is old enough that most of their family's gone. Now, we don't see it quite like they saw it at 60. Now, you talk to somebody that's 89. My mother's 89 on her birthday. She's got very few people in her family still alive. There's maybe one or two people of her age group that hasn't already passed away. This is what you can apply that this way. He said, and he says in verse 10, well reported. And it is clearly known by the church members. Nobody's asking the question, is this true of this sister? Because it's well reported that of her good works. What good works? Well, you know what good works are. Works that are good and that are beneficial. And then Paul goes on to say, if she had brought up children, did she raise her children up to respect the elderly? See how this stuff just ties in? To respect the elderly, to honor their commitments, to be respectful, the aged. I've got these two grandsons. They love to open the door for people walking in. That says volumes to me when they do that. But that used to be something that was a common practice when I was a kid. But how often do you see it today? That if she had brought up children, raised up children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. This word brought up, same word that Paul uses in Timothy. He said, fathers, bring up your children in the nurture and admonition. Same word, same Greek understanding here. If she had lodged strangers. It's not saying that she necessarily had every stranger come visit her house. But she was hospitable. If there was an opportunity to have somebody at home, she opened it up. But not only that, in the church setting, when a visitor came in, she was the one you saw made a beeline to that stranger to embrace them and encourage them. Come in and be with us, encouraging them. She was entertaining strangers. Do you see what I'm getting at? As she lodged strangers, as she has washed the saints' feet. Now we know in our minds, when we say washing the saints' feet, we think about communion. That's what it's talking about. But it means something beyond even that. Washing strangers' feet means that she cooked the meals. She was hospitable to those that was under her roof and her care. She took care that their clothes were clean. The children's clothes were clean. See, this is a bonding together and fellowship and unity as a family that Paul's talking about. If she had relieved the afflicted, did she visit those that were sick? In the 21st century, did she pick up the phone and call? Did she help get the church to sign a card for somebody that was sick? When she heard somebody was in need, did she go and help with that need? Did she do those things? If she had diligently followed after every good work, this word diligent means that she kept after it. She kept after it through the good times. She kept after it through the hard time. She persisted and persevered in her good works. Nobody could tell her, why are you doing this? What's the point in doing this? Maybe she's got a child that has went out into the world and collapsed or whatever, got off into bad situations. But she diligently continued to pray for that child. You see how she stuck it out. The church, I remember the story that Elder Rowell, one of my fathers in the ministry, told me one time about a church off of old US 59. Said he passed by and saw signs at Trinity Baptist Church. Made a U-turn, went back to that church and went inside. And there was 3 elderly sisters there, 3 widows, praying for that church. They persevered. Somebody else might have come by and said, what's the point? Why are you praying for this church? God has abandoned this church and you. And he's been gone for some time now. I've never been able to find that church. But that church began to meet again. And God opened the doors and sent elders to preach to that church. See, she persevered. She kept asking and kept praying, and she followed after every good works. Now, I want to see that put into practice for just a minute. So let's go to Acts chapter 9. And I'm going to read about a sister here that's got a very interesting thing. This is Acts chapter 9. Let's pick up with verse 32. And it came to pass that as Peter, throughout all quarters, he came down also to the saints which at Lydda. And there found a certain man named Aeneas. And he had kept in his bed for 8 years and sick of the palsy. And Peter said to him, Aeneas, Jesus Christ maketh thee whole, arise, take up thy bed. And he arose immediately. Notice that something about Peter. He's been blessed by God to do miracles. Peter's not doing the miracle, but he's exercising the gift that God has given him. He's a good steward of what God has given him. And there dwelt at Lydda and Sharon saw him and turned to the Lord. Now look at verse 36. Now there was at Joppa a certain disciple named Tabitha. Notice this word disciple. This word disciple is the same word that we get that we use to translate the word of a deacon. We use the same word. Same word. She is a disciple, and her name is Tabitha. That means that she performed the duties. I don't know why or what the reason was, but she was performing the duties. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying she was ordained as a deacon. I believe if she was, it would say so. But she had the characteristics of service of one to another. And this word Tabitha, by the way, it means a gazelle. Y'all know the gazelle. You ever watch those nature programs? They've got the little pointy horn. They're just elegant. And that's the Hebrew, which by interpretation is called Dorcas. Dorcas is the Greek term. It also means gazelle. She was a beautiful woman. Now, I don't know how old she was, but this woman was full of good works. Now, tradition tells us, to go back and study it, it's assumed that Tabitha is a widow. She lives alone. And said she was full of good works and honor deeds which she did. She was elderly. She was one of these ones that you said were 60, but I want you to see the things that she did. And it came to pass that in those days that she was sick and died. And now, fortunately, Peter's in town. And whom they had washed, and they laid her in the upper chamber. And I thought about this for a minute. Now, they laid this body in the upper chamber. They took her upstairs. How much effort does it take to take somebody upstairs that's unconscious or not moving? Which is easier, to take somebody upstairs or put them in the room next to the front door? Why am I asking that? I want you to think about what is going on here. They took her to the upper chamber. Where did Jesus meet with his disciples? He met them in the upper chamber. Where did he tell them to prepare for the Passover? He met them in the upper chambers. When they met in worship, they always worshiped in the upper chambers. They always went to the upper chambers. Why would they take Tabitha's body to the upper chamber where they worshiped? You know, they had an anticipation about something. Peter was in town. You take this for what it's worth. Because I can't prove this with Scripture, but I'm just going to tell you my opinion. they took Tabitha and laid her body in a place where they worshiped, anticipating that God would raise her from the dead, and they, along with Tabitha, would worship together. Now, I can't prove that. You take it for what it's worth. It may be worth nothing to you. But anyway, it says that she had died, and they put her in the upper chamber. For as much as Lydda was nigh to Joppa, they're close together, the disciples heard that Peter was there, and they sent unto him 2 men, desiring him that he would not delay to come to them. And when he was come, they brought him into the upper chamber, the place where they worship. The place where they worship, the upper chamber, is closer to heaven. He said, and all the widows, these are widows that were fellow widows. They were widows along with Tabitha. That's why all this emphasis is about the widows. And the widows stood by him, that is Peter, weeping, showing the coats. Notice something about Tabitha. She didn't just sit idle. She worked with her hands. She was busy with things. Showing the coats and the garments that Dorcas had made, that she'd been making, while she was with them. And you can see these widows, tears in their eyes. They obviously loved this woman Tabitha, this woman Dorcas. They loved her. And they were looking and reminiscing of the wonderful works that she had done. But Peter put them all forth. He followed the example of the Lord Jesus Christ. He said he knelt down. You know how when the Lord raised the young maiden from the grave, he put them all out of the room and said unto her, young maiden, arise. And then Peter followed that example of humility, and he turned in his body and said, Tabitha, arise. And she opened her eyes. And when she saw Peter, she sat up. Brothers and sisters, I want you to be able to see these things. Let's go back. He said, let's go back to 1 Timothy chapter 5. And I want to backtrack to verse 9. And he said, let not the widow be taken to number of 80 years old, having been the wife of one man, well reported of good works. We have the record here in scriptures that Tabitha was a woman well reported of good works, whom God blessed of the apostle Peter to raise her from the dead. That if she had brought up children, if she had lodged strangers, if she had washed the same feet, if she had relieved the afflicted, if she had diligently followed after good works. But listen to what he says, but the younger widows. See, everybody that was a widow wasn't necessarily 60 years old. It was very conceivable. There's a pattern. Let me read this on. But the younger women refused. Don't put the younger women on your list for support. Paul is simply saying that the church has got a responsibility to maintain their widows. If there were no Social Security, if there were no food stamps, if there were no welfare, if those things didn't exist, the church would have a responsibility to take care of the widows that are widows indeed. And that responsibility fell to the family that's called the family of God, because she was destitute, because she had no family she could turn to. Therefore, the church is her family. You see, we're all one family. Sister Debbie, I'm your brother, you're my sister, because we're bought by one man's blood. We all have that in common together. And the responsibility of the church to care for our widows who are widows indeed. We've got that responsibility. He said, but the younger women, don't put them down on your list. Paul's got a reason for saying this. It's not because Paul's mean. He said, the women refuse, for they shall become wanton against Christ. This word wanton, he's talking about, when he says young, he's talking about young. You all remember what that was like to be young? It's getting to be a dim memory in my mind, but I still remember how I felt when I was young. What he's talking about is that desire for companionship. They'll have a desire to be remarried. Now think about it from their perspective, because we tend to look at it from our century here. They have no support. There's no welfare office. I don't think they call it that anymore, but there's nothing like that. Well, her support is her children or her husband. Whenever a man took a wife to marry her, he assumed the full responsibility. He said when she begins to have that desire to be married again, when she has that desire to raise children, continue to raise children, when she wants a father for her children, he said when that begins to happen, they will marry. It was not something that it's not like Valentine's Day as we think about Valentine's Day. This was a necessity. It's an urgency. Now, is Paul saying we ought not to give our support to these widows? He's not saying that. He said, but they should not expect to be under the full support of the church. They're not going to carry her like they would with those widows indeed that are above 60, above 60. They said they will marry, having damnation because they've cast off their first faith. In other words, they forgot that the ones that go out into the world and they neglect the church, they don't need to be supported. The problem that we have with the government today encourages this going off and cast off their first faith. So there was a time, brothers and sisters, that it was expected that when our elderly people, when our fathers and mothers grew old, that we would take care of them as families. That was expected. Today it's almost unheard of. He said, and withal, learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but tattlers. This word tattler means they were gossipers. They were troublemakers, also busybodies. We see this pattern in the world where we pay mothers to have children. We pay, and if they get married, they lose their support. You see where I'm heading with this. When we turn away from the duties that God has commanded us to do, it always causes a problem. It's never good for society. Speaking things which they ought not. He said, I will therefore that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house, and that none occasion of the adversary to speak reproachfully. What Paul is saying is this: see to it that you do things this way. Why? So there's no reproach falls upon the church. No reproach falls upon the widows. No reproach falls upon the deacons. There's no reproach, do you see? That everything's done and decently in order. For some are, see, the reason he said that, look at verse 15. Paul says, because some are already turned aside after Satan. See, Paul was speaking from his experience. I'm speaking from my experience as well. Paul understood that whenever you give something to somebody for nothing, if you just pay women to have children, if you just pay women to have children out of wedlock, then what do you end up with is lazy and disrespectful people. People that depend upon that paycheck. They become hateful, they become mean, they become irreverent. Now, I'm speaking from my experience because I see it around me everywhere I look. He said, and Paul was saying in his day it had already taken place. How long does it take to get away from this? For these bad things to begin to happen? It begins to happen the day we turn away from the Lord. The day that we decide that we know a better way. He said, if any man or woman believeth have widows. He's talking about the church now. If there's a family of people who have widows in the church that are believers, let them relieve them. In other words, Paul's telling us what the priority is. It starts at home. If my mother or my father needs help, my first duty and responsibility is to take care of my parents. It's your responsibility. It's our responsibility. And not the church be charged. Why is he saying that? Because there are some widows that are widows indeed. The church must take care of those. So what Paul is saying is, if there's a widow that you can take care of them. Because they're going to need their resources to take care of those who can't take care of themselves. It's simple math. And that they may relieve them that are widows indeed. So they can focus upon that need. The ones that are above 60 years, that are 60, that they're going to have that responsibility. That they might be freed up and able to take care of that. It's God's design to do it this way. He said, let the elders, now this elders is talking about leadership. It's talking about, not just talking about pastors, it's also talking about deacons. Let the elders that have rule, let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor. That means be sure that you respect those that serve in the church. It's talking about your pastor. It's talking about your deacons. It's talking about those that exercise leadership in the church, and to make sure that they're respected and supported. He said, and especially those who labor in word and in doctrine. And I say that is speaking about the minister, but it's also speaking of the deacon. There are deacons who do this too. That they give their example in their words and in the doctrines. You see, we should never lay hands on a deacon or an elder who's not sound in both his word and his doctrine. We lay hands suddenly upon no man. For the Scripture saith, thou shalt not muzzle the ox that treadeth out the corn. There's a principle that Paul points back to under the law. And the labor is worthy of its reward. He said that because they labor in the church, we don't pay the ministry here. If you start paying the ministry a salary, you're going to get what you pay for. But there's a love that's given and a support that's given for them to take care of their needs. Because why? Because they're worthy of that support. Because that they've been called to the ministry. The church has set them in their offices. He said against an elder, this again we're talking about an office now, the deacon or the pastor. Against an elder, receive not an accusation, but before 2 or 3 witnesses. What does the law say? The law said, and let every man's word be established out of the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. You know, you could not put a man to death out of the mouth of 1 witness under the law. There had to be 2 and especially 3. Every word has to be established. Same way in the church. Just because somebody accuses an elder or a deacon or a pastor of some ungodly act, these things must first be proved. He said, but before 2 or 3 witnesses. And he said, them that sin, rebuke before all. There's no such thing as a secret sin. Now, Jesus sets it up for us. Let's hesitate right here to go to Matthew chapter 18. We'll start bringing our remarks to a close, that mark. We've talked about this before. We know these things. But it's a good idea sometimes to be reminded of it. In Matthew 18, it says, verse 15, he said, moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. So how does it start out? In the church, there's trouble in the church. You do it between the offender and the offended. Starts there first. Alone, privately, hoping to resolve things without causing a disruption in the church. And if he will hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother. But if he will not hear thee, if you knock on the door and he refuses to open the door and said, I'm not talking to you, I don't want nothing to do with you. Then he said, take with thee 1 or 2 more. How often do you see this exercised? It used to be very common practice in the church, but we see it done less and less. We need to get back to this. That in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let every word be established. There's that Deuteronomy chapter 19 again. And if you neglect to hear them, then tell it to the church. Not privately, but openly. If after you've met with him personally, one-on-one, after you brought a deacon or a brother or sister with you as a witness, after you've exhausted all those things, then it's to be brought before the church. But if you neglect to hear the church, let him be unto thee as a heathen man and a publican. Verily I say to you, whatsoever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Paul is saying you got the authority. Exercise it. Do it. And whatsoever you loosed on earth shall be loosed in heaven. But let's get back and wind this up. Verse 20 of the 5th chapter of 1 Timothy. Then them that sin rebuke before all, that others may fear. It should never be kept secret. It's like trying to ignore having cancer. You just don't do it. I mean, you do it to your death. You can ignore it for so long until eventually it metastasizes and you lose your life. You don't ignore it. He said, I charge thee before God. This is not a suggestion. Paul's not making suggestions here. Paul is speaking with the full weight of his apostleship. The full weight of God is behind what he writes in this letter. I command thee, Paul said before God, and the Lord Jesus Christ, and the elect angels. You know who the elect angels are? That's us. You and I. That's us today. That thou observe these things. What things? What it knows. Taking care of orphans, taking care of honoring father and mother. I charge you before God and before Jesus Christ. You make sure you tell the people these things. You make sure they do these things. Doing nothing by partiality. That's hard to do sometimes, brothers and sisters, to do things without partiality. Because I tend to want to protect my children. When they do wrong, I'm guilty. I'm going to tell you right now. I'm guilty about trying to hope that whatever they've done wrong will pass. Paul said you can't do it that way. And he says, lay hands suddenly upon no man. There used to be a time among the old Baptists that we took lots of time to exercise our ministry to be sure that they are approved in the church. That we liberated our brethren. We do that in this church too. Liberate our brethren. Give them time to exercise in the sister churches, they might be accepted, their word might be heard, that might be established. Lay hands suddenly upon no man. Neither be, that's talking about deacons as well. Not everybody who's got good gifts, taking care of painting or doing books and stuff like that, but not everyone that's like that ought to be called to the office of deacon. Things have to be proved. We're not going to go into any of that today. But so neither be partakers of other man's sin. Don't get caught up in the sins of this world. Keep thyself pure. Here's another thing that's lacking in our community today. There is no emphasis at all about keeping ourselves pure, about doing the right thing. He said, drink no longer water. See, little things like this I love. Because sometimes we forget that this is a letter that Paul wrote to somebody he loved. Think about the way he's writing this, and his care for young Timothy. Drink no longer water, but use a little wine for thy stomach's sake, and that often infirmities. You know what he's saying? He said, I know you have trouble with your stomach. Drink a little bit of wine, it'll settle your stomach. Think about how personal this is to Paul, and how Timothy, and what Timothy thought when he was reading this. Maybe Paul was concerned about it. Maybe Timothy was worried about this, worried about what people would think when he was trying to take care of his upset stomach. And Paul said to tell him, don't worry about that, brother. Here, take care of yourself. Some men's sins are open beforehand. That means they're easy to see. There's some people you can tell by the way they dress, the way they conduct themselves, the language they're using, that they got some problems. They got some issues. As they're going therefore to judgment. Not necessarily eternal judgment at the end of time, but the judgment of their actions are brought upon them. He said there's some men, and there are some men that they follow after. Sometimes people try to hide their sin, but eventually, Paul said, it catches up with them. This is the way it is. And we'll close with this verse. Some men's sins are open beforehand, going before into judgment. And some men they follow after. Then he said, likewise, also do good works. Also do good works. Of some are manifest beforehand. Some people that they do good works, they may not be trying to show it, but you realize that was a good thing that brother did. You see what I'm saying? That you're doing the good works. You're letting the light shine. And they that are contrariwise cannot be hid. In other words, it said those that don't do it, it's like trying to hold the beach ball under the water. You can do it only so long. Eventually, you're going to get tired, you're going to slip, but here comes that beach ball. Up it comes, and their sins are revealed. We're going to stand and sing a song. If there be one or more have a desire to unite with the church and haven't done it, if God put it in your heart to number yourself among the saints here at Wichita Falls, and that would be that opportunity to do so.